Evening all, massive crowd, thanks for coming. Tonight we've got a workshop on physiology with Anna Holt from the VIS. Anna will talk through the periodized program that has just been emailed out. And if you haven't received a copy, let me know and I'll make sure that you get a copy. It is also available on the Road to our website on the Pathways page. Anna will make the slides and the handout available as well, which I'll put up on the Pathways page tomorrow. Any questions? Let Anna know, otherwise I'll be around afterwards as well. Thanks.
All right, hi everyone. So today I've been asked to share my knowledge in training programming and periodization. So I'll just get Jen, can you go to the first one? So we're going to start off with a bit of a background into what's happening in our bodies as to why we need to consider periodizing throughout a season, but also considerations for programming. So I'll talk a little bit about what energy systems we're using, how we use those to determine training zones or establish training zones. I'll talk a little bit about how that then kind of influences, or we use this polarized model of training to influence what we're doing and what the associated adaptive responses are, so we get a bit of an understanding of what's actually happening in our bodies when we train in different training zones. And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of actual programming. So we're going to start off very broad. So with our macrocycle, our years plan, and then we're just going to delve deeper and deeper. So getting into our mesocycle, so looking at our training phases, and then into our microcycle planning. How do we structure our week in order to get the most out of it? And then within each session of the week, what are the considerations we need to have in order to get the most out of each session, in order to achieve the purpose of the session and get the adaptive response that we're actually looking for. And that'll include some session examples, and then looking a little bit into some pointers on how we can get the most out of each session. So importance of the warm-up, limiting turnaround times and stroke rate selection, and how that can influence the outcome of our session, even though we may think that we're hitting all the right things to achieve its purpose. So I'll get into that. Next slide, please. All right, so starting off with a bit of background. So I'm sure most of you are aware of the energy systems that we have in our bodies to produce energy. So we have our aerobic system and our anaerobic system. Our aerobic system produces energy using oxygen. It doesn't fatigue, it can go essentially indefinitely. And then, although it is limited to how much energy it can produce. We then have our anaerobic system, which as an outcome of using our anaerobic system, we produce lactate, which doesn't cause fatigue itself, but is associated with fatigue, but in turn allows us to generate a heap of energy. And so in a rowing race, rowing is quite unique in that we use both of these energy systems to a really high extent. So this is an example of the aerobic and anaerobic energy produced during a 6-minute ergometer test. So you can see that aerobic energy, or the power produced aerobically in blue and in pink anaerobically. And what you can see is that there's a large amount of anaerobic power. And it's not only at the start where it's commonly thought to be, it mostly occurs at the start of a race, but it occurs throughout the entire race as well. So that on average works out to be about an 85 to 15% contribution of our aerobic and anaerobic energy system. So what I'm getting at is that we need to train both of these systems to a high extent if we want to maximize our performance in a race. Jen? All right, so when we think about our aerobic and anaerobic energy systems, we want to think about how best to train those. And to do that, we do that by establishing training zones. And so the way that we establish training zones, or the best way that we can, is using what we call a lactate curve. So an example of a lactate curve is on screen here. So we can see power output down the bottom. This is usually in rowing we'd do a 7x4 minute test, so this is a bit of an exaggerated example with a lot of steps. Each one of these little diamonds is a stage where power output has increased, and it's a lactate reading. So we have lactate up the y-axis. But essentially what we can see here is we have this period along here where as intensity increases, our lactate doesn't increase. And that tells us that our body is producing its energy predominantly through its aerobic systems. We're not having any anaerobic contribution to the production of energy. Jen, I'll just get you to... Yeah, so then there comes a point where we get to an intensity where we can no longer produce enough energy to meet the demands of our exercise through our aerobic system alone. So our anaerobic system kicks in, and that's when we start to produce lactate. So we see this shift, and we start to produce lactate at a reasonably steady state until we get to another point. Jen? Thank you. Where we start to produce lactate at a really fast rate. So we start to accumulate it, what we say exponentially, essentially. A lot of lactate over small changes, small increases in power output. And so these two turn points in our lactate curve we define as our first and second lactate threshold. So our aerobic threshold, LT1, and our anaerobic threshold, LT2. And we use these thresholds to establish training zones from. So Jen, I'll get you to... Yeah, so below our, we at the VIS and predominantly in rowing from what I've seen, use a 5-zone training model. There are different training models you can get, but most commonly we see 2 training zones below the first lactate threshold. So we call them here T1 and T2. Essentially, these are our aerobic endurance training zones. So T1 is typically a recovery zone. T2 is where we do our long duration, low intensity training. We then have T3, Jen, thank you. T3, which occurs between our first and second lactate thresholds, and then above our second lactate threshold. This is typically split in rowing into 2 more zones. So Jen, I'll just get you to, back one. So our T4 and our T5. So these are our high intensity zones. T4 is commonly referred to as our threshold zone, our anaerobic threshold zone, and T5 is our VO2 max zone. So in T5 is where we're producing, or where we're working at VO2 max. Yeah.
These graphs, I'm assuming these graphs are fairly accurate. Do they differ for male and female, and do they differ for young and old?
The shape of the curve itself, in terms of us picking out the thresholds, doesn't change. So it may be higher, the whole thing may be shifted higher. If you're really fit, the whole thing will be shifted to the right, and I'll talk about the changes we see in the curve as you get fitter. So males will be further to the right, they'll be able to produce higher power outputs for a given lactate. Or it may be shifted to the left if you're unfit. Yeah, but the general shape, we don't look at specific numbers when we're picking out these thresholds necessarily. We have guideline numbers, but we're looking at the changes in the curve. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of our high intensity training zones, these can be split up further, and you'll see that we can, like in our model at the VIS, we go up to 7 zones. When we're using heart rate, we typically go to 5, because in T5 you'll be reaching your max heart rate there. So you can't really go up, but if you're working off power, you essentially can continue stacking zones up above that second threshold, just depending on what your focus is. But if we move on, so keeping in mind that I know you guys don't all have access to lab testing, so we would bring our athletes into the lab and establish their first and second lactate thresholds and their training zones based off that. But you can also estimate training zones if you don't have access to lab testing. So this is a bit of a guideline to how you would do that. So if you're going off your athlete's 2K average power output from their most recent 2K test. You'd be looking at, if you're doing a T2 session, you'd be looking at being between 45 to 60% of that. T4, 75 to 95, T5 above 95%. So, and then there's based off heart rate max as well. So there's the age-old heart rate max equation of 220 minus your age. Heart rate is very variable. It's best if you're using that just to put a heart rate monitor on your athletes. If they're doing a 2K erg test or if they're doing any T5 sessions, then you'll get their heart rate max from that, and then you can have a little bit more of an individualized measure if you're using that rather than estimating their heart rate max, essentially. In terms of how it feels to the rower, T1 very light, T2 light to somewhat hard. So T2 is actually quite hard. It's not easy training. That's often one that's or a misconception. And when we're training in it, we want to be training towards closer to our first lactate threshold than beyond. So that 45 to 60%, you want to be pushing up towards that 60% ideally. And then up to I really need a pointer. One more. Yeah, so it explains a little bit about why we need to spend so much time below the first lactate threshold. So when we train in this zone, the effect that it's having on our body are long-term structural changes. So our heart increases in size, and wall thickness increases, and the amount of blood volume that it can hold increases. So quite structural changes. We our blood volume increases, capillarization, so the amount of blood vessels in your muscles, growing blood vessels within your muscles, type 1 muscle fiber size and number, and then mitochondrial number and structure. So mitochondria are little factories within our cells where energy is produced, essentially. And then within that we have oxidative time. The stimulus doesn't need to occur for as much time for them to be achieved. So it gives you a little bit of background as to why we spend so much time below LT1 and not as much time above. There's also the consideration of the fatigue effect and the recovery time. So sessions below our first lactate threshold we recover really quickly from. Sessions above our second lactate threshold take a lot longer to recover from. So anywhere from 20 hours plus, essentially, to get back to our pre-training state for sessions above our second lactate threshold, whereas we can recover really quickly within a day from the sessions down here. So another consideration for programming them. Cool. So the reason that we don't intentionally program in the middle here in our T3 zone is because when we do sessions below our LT1, we're getting this stimulus to our body. Above LT2, we're getting this stimulus. When we train in the middle, we're getting what's called a cross stimulation. So we're telling our bodies to adapt not just to one type of training, but to both. And so instead of getting a large response in one direction, we sort of get a half response in both. And so it's better to focus our energy in getting a large response from one and a large response from another, rather than a sort of half response, a mixed response in both directions, if that makes sense. All right, so I think that's the end of our background slide. Oh no, last one. So when we train this way, what we expect to see to our lactate curve, going back to our lactate curve, is this rightward and downward shift. So one more, yeah, cool. So what we can see is that over time, so this is an exaggeration, but just to sort of show you what we see, over time the lactate curve shifts to the right. So the intensity that we train at before we start to see an accumulation of lactate increases, essentially, and then same with our rapid increase in lactate, our second lactate threshold. All right, next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of how we actually put together a periodized plan. Now we have more insight into the background. How does it all fit together, and what do we do when and why? So this, you're not expected to have too deep of a look at this. This is just an example of the periodized program that we've put together at the VIS for our VIS and VPP athletes. And this will be shared out with the slides, so you'll be able to have a good look at it. But essentially what we're going to do now is look a little bit deeper into how this is all, we're going to pull it apart essentially, bit by bit. All right. So we're going to start off with our macrocycle. So keeping in mind our macrocycle is our annual plan. So minutes off, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. You can do, so there's some example sessions there. I won't talk through them again, you can see them, but one thing you can do, really short duration intervals, lots of them, so the 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, or minute on, minute off. Because you're doing so many of them and you're keeping your work to rest ratio equal, they end up being, like, they look like a speed session, but they would actually put an athlete's heart rate into T5 zone. So it's another thing to do. And well, actually, yeah, with these ones, you want to get shorter and sharper intensity go up, but you also want to be progressing them towards being able to achieve longer duration ones, because if you think of a race duration, 6 to 7.5 minutes, if they can achieve T5 for that entire period, that's what you want to be progressing them towards. So mixing it up as you get towards your comp phase, and in your comp phase, mixing it up between your really short ones to get the real anaerobic stimulus, and then also progressing them a bit longer in order to get more progression into them being able to maintain that intensity for a longer period of time. So your stroke rate range would be around race rate, so plus or minus 2 strokes per minute from race rate is typical, but essentially if they just go within reason, then that's what they'll probably self-regulate themselves into anyway. And then we have our T6 session. This is our speed work session, so we call them primers in New Zealand. I haven't heard them be called that here, but this is your typical race prep type session. So towards your pre-comp, your comp phase, you might introduce this once a week for a short period of time leading right up to your competition, or as prep right before, like in your tapering phase. So total work duration is pretty short, and as is interval duration with long rests. So again, the quality is really key in these ones, letting them completely recover, so 5 minutes or more, completely recover their anaerobic glycolytic stores in order to perform them, the next one with quality. And really high stroke rate range. So when prescribing them, you, as primers before racing, you typically look at the duration of the event that you're doing and then break it down from there. So for 2K racing, you'd use 2K as your total distance, and you wouldn't add more than 2K. I've seen 2.5 to 3 be used, so you could go up to 3K, but you don't want to do too many of them essentially. You want them to be of high quality. So an example is you break them down, 1 750, 2 250s, something like that. Bigger boats can do longer pieces, obviously, because the duration is shorter. With your smaller boats, you'd look at doing shorter pieces, but you just pick them as what you're interested in working on in your race. So if you want to practice the 500, or if you want to practice your last 250 or whatever, you can use that as your focus. Cool. And then the last little section that I have for you guys, if you keep going, is just some considerations for when you're performing these sessions. So a key one that everyone knows about, but is often, the importance of it is often forgotten, is the warm-up. So when you're doing your warm-up, you want 15 to 20 minutes at a reasonably hard pace. You should be replicating the pace that you're doing in your training session in some form. So if you were doing a T4 or T5 session, then you want to be doing pieces at that intensity in the warm-up to prepare your body for performing those sessions straight away, essentially. So yeah, 4 to 10 minutes worth of intervals. If you, like for example, at T4 or T5 pace, if you're doing a T4 or T5 session, or if you're doing a T2 session, then it's rowing hard. It's not, you're not, just paddling up to your starting point. If you want to include some technical stuff, rowing in 2s or 4s, doing arms only, bodies and arms, that's okay, but it's not included as part of your warm-up. So you're not actually warming your body up, that's your technical warm-up, right? So you would do that first, but then you'd also make sure that you get a solid warm-up in order to be prepared for these sessions. So on screen I have an example of why this is really important. So this is a heart rate trace from one of our athletes. So the session that was done was 12 by 3 minutes on, 5 minutes, 2 minutes off. And what you can see here is, so this is a T4 session, and you can see they're hitting, so these are their heart rate zones here. So our T1 zone, this is specific to them, lab testing, T1, T2, T3, T4. You can see they're hitting T4 through here, so perfect. They're executing the session really, really well. But what we can see, so they're hitting it here, but when we get to these first three, they're not hitting it. They're in T3. And this is a normal response. It takes a while for your body to actually respond and get into the appropriate zone. And this is after the athlete did, well, I mean, they're in T2. They didn't do a hard warm-up. But even if they did a really good warm-up, you would still see this to an extent. Like you can see it within the pieces itself, and that there's this heart rate response occurring through here. So if you do a proper good warm-up, what you're doing essentially is you're cutting away these. Like you'll still get a bit that aren't immediately in, but if you can cut away these ones, you're getting you're increasing the duration of the stimulus that you're giving. Instead of giving them 3 of the intervals that are T3 and the rest T4, you're giving them more in the desired training zone, if that makes sense. If they do a really poor warm-up, what you're looking at is, extending the period of time it takes for them to actually reach the training zone that you're wanting them to train in. And then another good one to keep in mind is, sort of related, is to be really strict with your turnaround times. So if you think back to those turnaround times or those rest periods that we talked about in our intervals, there is a reason for them. So as a refresher, 1 to 2 minutes during T2, continuous as possible, 1 to 3 minutes during T4, and 3 to 5 minutes during T5, so equal work to rest ratios. And the reason for this is the same, in that if they're getting too much recovery between pieces, their heart rate response is going to be their heart rate is going to go down, and it's going to take longer for them to get back up into the desired training zone. So this is a really good example in that the break wasn't actually that much longer. So again, a heart rate trace from one of our athletes showing training zones, heart rate zones, 10 sets of 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off. You can see this period here. So she's hitting, it's a T4 session, T4 zone, great. And then we get to this period where heart rate drops right down, and there isn't actually that much more gap. There isn't actually that much more time. And what I actually expect happened in this one is that she was paddling, she was doing active recovery through here, paddling, and then she completely stopped here. And we can see how much that heart rate dropped. Like it's such a big response, right? But then look at this one. Now we're no longer in T4, just for that effect. So now our stimulus is diminished. So keeping in mind as best as you can to stick to those turnaround times, because it is like your heart rate drops really quickly. There is the lag effect of it, and its increase again means that you might not actually be in the zone that you intend to be in. In order to achieve the purpose of your session, make sure that you're really adhering to the parameters that fit you into that session. And then the last one is the importance of your stroke rate, prescribing stroke rate. So you may prescribe all other parameters within the session, but if your stroke rates are off, that can affect where you're actually, what that session is actually being done in. So this is a typical one that I see a lot, T4 session being prescribed. So the description over there, 4 sets of 2Ks, first one at 20. So these are row-backs. So again, with the row-backs, it goes back to the last point in that the recovery periods are too long. And you can see how much the heart rate drops through there as a result. But the important one for this one is the effect of the lower rates. So, and our first one in 20, so it's a T4 session, but our first one, we're just solid T3. We're not reaching our T4 zone. Our second one, we have rate steps. And we can see when we hit 28 at the end, we are actually hitting our T4 zone, but the ones before, we're not getting there. So again, the same session, but then look at the one that's at rate 24, at rate 28. We're spending the majority of the piece in T4. So if we were to add up how much time over the whole session we actually got in T4, it wouldn't be that much. If they were all done at 26 and above, we would be seeing the majority of our program time in the zone that we programmed in. So what I want you to think about is, are we achieving the purpose of our session? We're programming a T4 session, but are we actually giving the body a stimulus to adapt to a T4 session, or is it T3? Cool, and I think that's it. Yeah, so thank you very much. Just a quick one before I take questions is, I hope there's a few people watching online, but for those of you here, I'm down at the river every morning, so if you ever have any questions, anything, you've got my email address as well. I'm more than happy to have a chat. If you want to come and have a chat, flick me an email or just come up and talk to me. And these slides will be sent out to those who registered, and we may make them available somehow online maybe as well to those who didn't. And again, that print out the PDF with the session descriptions to help you plan your sessions within your training zones will be available as well. Cool. Anyone have any questions?
Is there a big variance in between what both sides are in, between taking a single cell through to a quad or something?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't looked at it specifically, but I would think that the larger the boat size, the less stressful it is on the body. But then that's not to say if you're doing your hard sessions, you're still going to be getting a good stimulus from them in a big boat, and it depends on like what your intention is. Like obviously you need to train together to perform well in bigger boats. So where possible, we would say, like with our group, they do most of their sessions in small boats because it is a greater physiological stimulus. But then there is importance in doing your big boat sessions for the skill and rowing together in rhythm and all that aspect of it as well. Yeah.
Do you mind if I jump
Yeah?
in?
Yeah.
What we found has been, depending on your skill level, will depend on the stimulus. So if you're novice to sculling or you just learn to scull or row a pair, you often can't produce the power or the force to get your heart rate up high enough.
Yeah.
So oftentimes those kind of athletes will prescribe stuff on the ergo to do those physiological sessions where we're trying to get a threshold stimulus or something like that. And similarly, so typically it just depends on where you're at. Like the better you are as a more skillful rower, it's a harder session in the smaller boat.
Yeah.
And then the more novice you are, it's probably you're able to do harder work in the small boat.
I'm unsure if you mentioned this at the start. You mentioned your research through your masters, and I realised you're currently doing a PhD as well. What is your PhD currently in? What are you currently researching?
So I'm looking at the application of power meters in rowing. So you'll see me down here tinkering with the peach gates. Yeah, so I have several studies in it, but first of all, looking at their validity. So do they measure what we think they measure? Are they telling us accurate and reliable information?
Is it the peach system itself?
So I looked at the peach, the NK, and the Weber or power meter. Yeah, so I've still analysing results for power, but I have some interesting results for angle I can talk to you about later if you're interested. And then from that, moving on, looking at using the power meters as a tool for technical assessment. So knowing that in rowing there's a whole lot of technical variables that we often talk about and we coach, but there's not actually much research behind which of these and what aspect of them have the greatest effect on performance. It's another one of my studies, and then the one I'm currently collecting data for at the moment is looking at them as a training tool. So can we use them to monitor load over time, and does it give us more information than heart rate measures? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? No. All right, well, thanks all for coming and listening and giving your time. And again, if anyone wants to chat, I'm more than happy to have a conversation.
Thanks very much, Anna. The PowerPoint slides will be made available up on the Royal Victoria website under Education, along with the video from tonight's presentation. Up next we have the state team selectors, just talking through the selection policy and allowing coaches an opportunity to ask any questions. So hang around if you want to hear that. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to Anna.